Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us again for the part 3 of the Holocaust series. Lou, how are you?
Doing very well.
Good, good. So thanks for listening to the first 2 parts of the Indian Holocaust. I hope before you listen to this part 3 that you go back and listen to part 1 and 2. It'll make a lot more sense to you. But I think I was talking to Lou before this started, and I was wondering whether I had made clear some of the things that I wanted to get across, and I'm not so sure. So I will briefly, even if you've heard part 1 and 2, just make sure that I've gotten across the salient points that I did want to get across. And that is that India was, first of all, a very peaceful country, is a very peaceful country, and has never waged war on any other country, never. Its only fault was that it was an extremely wealthy country, probably the wealthiest country in the world for all time until the 1500s, when the East India Company first started its foray into trading in India. Angus Madison, who was British, did a survey of the GDPs of the various countries throughout history and all over the world. And he said that 24% of the world's GDP came from India until 1500. And when the British came, it kept dropping and dropping until by the time the British left in 1947 or 1948 is when Angus Madison said the GDP of India's contribution to the world was 3%, one of the poorest countries in the world. So India went from being the richest country to the poorest country. England went from one of the poorest countries to one of the richest countries in the world. That was the quote unquote fault of India, to be rich, which attracted people from various European countries, Portugal, France, Spain, and England, into India and perpetrated many crimes. And this was a crime, what the British did. And that's what I'm going to allude to. So that was one
thing. From a
thing.
Financial standpoint would have been bad enough. And I want to throw this out there because when I was doing the summaries for these pieces, we never threw out a number of deaths from the British rule here and what we're about to talk about. And we're talking tens of millions of deaths, and we have no idea what the actual number is. And that's why, as I told you before the show, I'm really kind of grateful we decided to title these the Indian Holocaust, because we have a framework for what the Holocaust is from the Jews in Germany, of course, and how horrific that is. But especially here in the West, we don't have the same context with what the British did to India. And by the way, the British were doing it to India right up through World War II.
Yes, while pointing the finger at Germany for their Holocaust.
Yeah.
So that Lou is right that the numbers are astounding. More and more of the Indian researchers and British researchers are now looking into how many deaths were caused in India during the time that they were there. And during the last 15 years of their rule in India, there were this is calculated to be 37 million deaths. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the famines that the British claimed caused these deaths, but it was purely due to salt deprivation on the part of the British, conscious deprivation of salt to the human beings of India by the British, which resulted in these deaths, and taking away the food and grains that the Indians had harvested and sending it to Britain and to other parts of the world where the British soldiers were stationed, caused part of but the salt deprivation, from what we're seeing now, is the primary cause of the hastened death. And Lou, I don't know if you still have those photographs that we had drummed up. Maybe we can start showing those to see.
Not handy, but I'll try to find some here.
Okay. So the other thing I wanted to make sure I got across was that there was plenty of salt in India. India was one of the richest and is one of the richest salt-laden countries in the world. The oldest salt mines in India are in India. Salt mines in the world are in India. Just one mountain of salt that there is in India is has 70 billion tons of pure salt. Now, salt can be adulterated. Salt can be, when you extract it, it can be dirty with other substances. But this is pure crystalline salt. If you break it, there's not much adulteration. So there was plenty of salt. That was the other thing I wanted to get across. The next was that just as you breathe air, oxygen, and you need it to live, and you drink water, without, if a country were to come take over your country and say, we're going to tax you for, if there was a way for them to prevent you getting air or water and say, unless you pay, you're not going to get water to drink or air to breathe, you would pay whatever you had for the sake of your children, your spouses, etc., your loved ones. So salt is of the third category there. And let me read to you a couple of quotes. A book was written by William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, thanks for those photographs, Lou. William Jennings Bryan was Secretary of State of the United States of America and then mayor of New York City. He wrote a book called British Rule in India, and he wrote there the constant aggression of the West upon the peaceful and unwarlike East, instigated by commercial enterprise, if not commercial greed, has been invariably in the name of Christianity. We have taken possession of their choicest wealth and their provinces and their best ports. This is by William Jennings Bryan. Then the next thing I wanted to make sure I got across is that the British not only taxed the salt that people were to eat, and higher and higher and higher higher and higher percentages of salt until people just couldn't afford to buy the salt. I wanted to make sure I got that across. And the way they did it was finally to put a hedge along three sides of India and block out access to the ocean where they could make salt freely from salt water, or block out access to the salt mines or the salt lakes so that people could not get it. And I'm going to talk about that more today. And this hedge that the British built was only found out by this person called Roy Moxham, and who wrote a book on it called The Great Hedge of India. And much of what I got, I took from there and then researched it further from the books that he had referred to. And in there, one of the books that he talked about is written by Sir John and Richard Strachey, who was in the British government working in the finances public work of India. And these two brothers wrote this. There grew up gradually a monstrous system to which it would be almost impossible to find a parallel in any tolerably civilized country. This, they're writing about their own country, that they're basically uncivilized for taxing the salt by putting such a monstrous system such as the hedge. And lastly, Mahatma Gandhi wrote that except for water, there is no article except for salt, by taxing which the government can reach even the starving millions, the sick, the maimed, and the utterly helpless. The salt tax of the British is the most inhuman tax that man can devise. This is by Mahatma Gandhi. So those were the three things that I wanted to make sure that I got across to the audience. Anything else you want to add, Lou?
Yeah, I think it's important to actually summarize it in that there was no shortage of salt. There was no limit to the amount of salt that could be harvested in India. The deprivation of salt to the natives, to Indians, was purely financially based and was ultimate greed, to the point where people saw the pictures where people were dying again in the tens of millions for no other reason other than the greed of the British at this point, because there would have been plenty of salt to give to the Indian people and still made a lot of money elsewhere with the salt. But this was a purely greed-based enterprise. That's all it was about, was money.
Absolutely correct. A couple of things to add there. One is you mentioned photographs, and for those who are listening on podcasts, you cannot see the photographs. So if you want to see the photographs, you should go to either Facebook, Ancient Stories, or YouTube, Ancient Stories, where Lou's photographs will show up. The second
Or on
thing,
Spotify. We have videos on Spotify as well. Yeah.
oh, you do. Okay, good. The second thing is I'm going to be talking about where the salt was all over India in a bit today, but um, you should know that because salt was plentiful and very inexpensive in India, the Indians used salt liberally until the British came in, and they didn't know that they had to conserve it. Had they grown up in a country where salt was not freely available, for generations they would have known that cooking, etc., should be done with less salt, or be able to conserve on their salt use and make sure they used more salt in the summer when it's hot and you sweat than in the winter when it's not. However, because salt was freely available, the cooking that the mothers taught the daughters, or the a person who cooked in the house, was such that salt was wasted. And people didn't know, once the British took over and started taxing salt, that there was any other way to do it. For instance, cooking rice, they sprinkled a lot of water, salt in the water in which they cooked. And then they just drained the water and the salt got wasted. Similarly, there was salt sprinkled in the vegetable water that they were cooking, and then the water was thrown away. So there was a lot of wastage, which they continued after the tax was very high because they were villagers, they didn't know. And the other thing was that these people who were dying from salt deprivation did not know that it was salt loss that was causing it. They thought, they attributed it to other things. Otherwise, they would have known to conserve the salt in their food. So I just wanted to add that. Talking about famines, which caused millions and millions of deaths. According to the British, this was all from lack of food, which they called famines. However, in countries that are like India, remember that two things cause good harvest. One is the weather in terms of temperature, sun, and the second is the rain. So every farmer realizes that there are some years of good harvest and some years of bad harvest. So what a farmer does is during the years of good harvest, he takes the grain, wheat, rice, whatever things that don't get spoiled, and puts them in granaries. Um, and during the bad years, when there's not a good harvest, he eats off of whatever is there in those silos.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's the same all over the world, not just in India, but especially so in India because there's so many years where there's less rain or something happens. What the British did is as soon as the harvest was taken, whether it was a plentiful harvest or not such a, they took most of it. They took most of it to ship to England. And they would ship it to those countries which they colonized so their British soldiers could have it, which then, in the years that there was not a good harvest, left nothing. And that resulted in what they called a famine because of a poor harvest. It was man made, it was British made, it was
Mm-hmm.
because they took away. Now, this harvest stealing occurred in every year. There was no shortage, never any shortage if they had left it the way it had been going on for thousands of years. That's very, very important. Now, the British called these all famines. In 1877, 1.3 million people died, according to official estimates. And this is considered to be a serious underestimate. They said that these people who died, all of the famines, they died of plain and simple starvation.
Mm-hmm.
However, and they said this was from other causes, which they claimed to be diarrhea and fever. 12% of all the deaths of the millions and millions that died were ascribed to hunger and starvation. 63% they said was because of fever and bowel complaints. Now, we've spoken in the previous episode that salt depletion causes the diarrhea and vomiting, lassitude, and then death. right? So there's resistance
Mhm.
to infections. When you have less salt in your body cannot fight the infections that were common in India. So there's multiple amoebae, parasites, various diseases such as typhus, typhoid, cholera. All of these things, when you're feeling healthy, you can perhaps have a better chance of fighting it. But when you're not, when you don't have enough salt in your system, you cannot fight this and you die. And those deaths are attributed to fever and bowel complaints or complications. So if you look at all the summary of all the famines that took place, they were all since the British took over. And there's many of them. Most of these were attributed to diarrhea and fever and were hastened along by salt depletion, just so we know. Now, very quickly, I'm going to go through the rest of this because I want to talk about the hedge for the last 15 minutes or so. Human milk has salt in it. So
Mhm.
when a mother is feeding an infant, the infant is not deprived of salt. But whatever salt the mother has in her body is excreted through the milk for the baby. That's how nature does. And the mother is again further depleted of milk, and then the milk dries
Mm.
up. The mother's body protects itself by drying up the milk. The child doesn't get milk, nor
Mm.
does she get the salt, the baby, and the child becomes malnourished. The other thing that happens, and of course, then the mother perhaps even dies, or the child dies. What's interesting is that studies have been done that showed that after hundreds of years of this kind of salt depletion, the genetic changes that take place in a human being's body from salt depletion generation after generation cause changes in the physical stature, height, weight, and healthiness of a human being. So that's a very strong, forgetting about the millions, 37 million is the number that I read, 37 million people that were caused to die by salt depletion. Putting that aside, what has happened now is that my body, my next generation's body, everything has to rework its genes to get over what was done to
Mm.
our elders and ancestors over the past so many hundred years by what the British did. The
So
other
there's
thing that,
genetic damage that lingers till today.
yes,
Mhm.
lingers to today. So salt loss causes vomiting. Vomiting causes excess depletion of salt. And diarrhea also, you lose salt. When you lose salt, you get vomiting and you get diarrhea. So it becomes a vicious cycle.
Mm.
So this hastens along the death. Same thing happens with farm animals. Now, carnivores, I think I started to touch on this in the one of the previous episodes. Carnivores get their salt from eating herbivores. They eat other animals that have salt in their body. And when they eat it, the carnivores get their salt. Herbivores rely on salt in the ground, which they lick if there's salt on the ground, or in salt that is added to their fodder. Farm animals need salt. British made no allowance for
Mm.
that. They didn't even make allowance for human beings to get salt. Forget
Right.
about the animals. Indians are vegetarians, mostly. So they didn't get much salt from meat. In order to get your salt from vegetables, there's a misconception that vegetables and fruits have salt in it. To get your daily intake necessary for your body, you would have to eat your own body's weight in vegetables and fruits in
Wow.
one day to get
Yeah.
that much salt. So that's not possible. So the lack of salt caused in the farm animals caused less milk from the cows and poor cattle health, so that the cows, again, genetically, which were healthy cows 200, 500 years ago, have now, if you look at cows in India, they're very skinny and genetically poor in terms of their health. You saying something, Lou?
No, I'm just stunned because I keep going back to the fact that none of this was necessary. This was all just a total disregard for the Indian country and culture and people.
Yeah, and interestingly, there was a small percentage of people in the British Parliament that knew what was going on. I mean, everybody knew. Everybody knew. It was in the newspapers. There were criticism about what the East India Company was doing, and then when the British government took over in 1857, what the British government was doing. But they were oblivious to any criticism. What you're saying about the greed, was brought up in Parliament, and it's there in the parliamentary records that these debates took place by people who are concerned and saying this is not Christian what you're doing. What you're doing in the name of Christianity is not the proper way to be a Christian. What you're doing is wrong. And the British Parliament voted against it, and they said it's fine. What we're doing is fine.
Well, this is
So
a complete devaluation of the Indian people. And as you mentioned in an earlier episode, a lot of it is based on the fact that it wasn't a Christian culture.
That's right. The Queen had said to the East India Company, it's written in the charter, you can look it up. The charter says you can wage war and do these kinds of things as long as it is not a Christian country. So when it's not a Christian country, these things are allowed. But the decreased salt consumption had a general effect on the entire population. So all Indians from that time. The part that I'm repeating here is that the victims who took less salt, this is what happens. If you have less water or you have less food, you know, because you've all felt it sometime or the other, you feel thirsty and you do think of nothing else but getting something to drink, water. When you're hungry, you think of nothing else but food. You say, I want food. When you are deprived of salt, you would think that your body says, I'm craving salt. No. What happens is your body doesn't realize it. When your body is deprived of salt, gradually you feel more tired, you feel lethargic. You don't have the symptoms. Mild salt deprivation, early stages causes lassitude, tiredness. Your work output goes down. You can't till the farms and you can't do any work. Then you ultimately faint. When you faint, the beauty here, not the beauty, but the horror is that if a person faints because of loss of water, you can put a glass to his mouth and you can make him drink. But the only way to replenish the salt in a person that's fallen down, is unconscious as a result of salt depletion, is with an IV, a saline IV. That's why you notice that in hospitals, the first thing they do is to put in a saline, which is salt, sodium chloride, IV into a person. That's how they replenish it. You cannot force a person to ingest salt. So how do we then find out how many people actually died from salt deprivation when the British are saying that these people all died from famine? Because it looks very similar. It's impossible. The British doctors, if you go back to the parliamentary records and arguments, say the numbers are in the millions, and 37 million people have died during this, and the majority in the last 15 years of the British occupation. Winston Churchill, who was thought of very highly in most Western countries, was a racist. And I think last time I talked about all of the comments he made about the racist, the horrible comments that he made about Indians in general. Just didn't care. Churchill and his war council just wanted to take as much as they could from India for their soldiers and send it across to the rest of the world, with complete disregard for what happened to the Indians. Military soldiers were made sure they got, British military soldiers, at least 1 ounce per day. Even the prisoners in their jails got a little bit less, but not as little as the Indians citizens got, which was less than a fraction of 1 ounce per day. And that's why they died. So India had no shortage of salt. There was plenty of salt. So the customs that they charged, the duty, had to build a wall. The wall that went from 2,300 miles, almost the same distance as from London to what is today Istanbul. It was 14 feet high at some heights, most of the time, 14 feet wide, and went on for 2,300 miles. Every 4 miles or so, it would have a opening cut into it. And there were guards stationed there. There were 12,000 guards manning this hedge all along the border. So there were people stationed within those openings through which people could go. And when they went through that opening, the people were checked. Men were checked, women were checked thoroughly to see if they had salt, even put into any cavities within the body. And the worst part was that these guards were quote unquote unsupervised. They were, of course, they didn't trust the Indian soldiers to guard these, so they were white British soldiers there. And those people took all kinds of liberties in their searches of both the men and the women and the daughters that went through these openings. It's horrible. The stories that I've read about what the British did to the women is horrible. What they did to the men, they would say, "Oh, here we found some salt on you," even though there wasn't any. It was planted, and then they'd say, "Okay, so we're going to tax you and take away whatever he had that had of value, or just throw them in jails, keep their women aside, and then whip them, beat them, torture them, or even kill them." It was absolutely, the stories are horrible. So in 1800, several parliamentary inquiries in the 1800s, several parliamentary inquiries were held as far as the salt supply and all of these horrible things that were going on. The doctors that had seen this, the British doctors, came back and told the parliament that this was what was going on. And the doctors testified that the lack of salt caused loss of resistance to all kinds of disease, including cholera and other diseases, to which the British claimed was the reason for all of these deaths. So the people have said to me, well, the British government didn't know. They did know. If you look at the parliament records, it's there. Number one. Number two, the British made sure that their own soldiers got a minimum of 1 ounce per day. They wouldn't do that if they thought that there was not a necessity for salt. The prisoners in the jails made sure that they got it, and the British doctors went again and again to the British Parliament and told them that this was the case, and the newspapers published articles that said that salt was necessary and this was being deprived to the Indians. Now, Lou, you had talked about the availability of salt in India, and I said that it was one of the richest countries for salt in the world. Where does salt come from? Number one, it comes from the sea. If you boil seawater and if evaporate, all the water evaporates, what's left is salt. So India has salt water, ocean, on most of its borders. And the border that is not covered by salt has the Himalayas. And there's also Himalayan salt, which you've all seen in the supermarkets, pink Himalayan salt. So the sea has tons and tons, unlimited amount of salt. Then there's rock salt mountains and there's rock salt deposits. And lastly, there's salt lakes, known as saline lakes, which has salty earth. Now, the lake may be 27 miles long, filled with salt water. And when the summer months come, the water would evaporate and the whole lake, 27 miles of it, would be full of salt, laying there, thick inches of salt. And all that people had to do was to go and scrape up the salt. Of course, that had been mixed then with earth and dirt and stuff like that, but it was impure, not as pure as the crystal that came from the mountains. The deposits of rock salt in Punjab was long ranges of hills with inexhaustible supplies, 70 billion tons of salt, 70 billion, unusually pure, only 2% impurities in all of that salt, huge crystals, outcrops of salt, the oldest mines in the world requiring minimal effort to extract and yet pure, inexpensive. From time immemorial, salt from any one of these sources in India reached the inhabitants of India very inexpensively. In Bengal, there were people called Malangis who extracted the salt. When the river was low, the oceans backed into the rivers. That was collected in canals with salt water and reservoirs. And in India, before the British came, these salt mines in Bengal, for instance, had about 60,000 men, who put in hard work, 60,000 men, and they would have, hold on one second, they would have 3 million mounds of salt per year. These
Wow.
60,000 men produced 3 million mounds. Now, one mound in India, that's not a weight measure that we know here in the United States, right, Lou?
Right. Yeah.
Mound?
No.
Okay. One mound is 82 pounds of weight. So you can multiply 3 million by 82. That's how much salt was produced just in the Bengal salt mines per year. Then there was Gujarat salt mines. Then there was the Himalayan mines. It's incredible. The East India Company, once they took over, made profits of millions and millions and millions of rupees on this salt.
I think the point that's important to make here is that, again, there was a unlimited amount of salt. There was enough salt for all these interests for the East India Company to make all the profits that they could make, to take care of the Indian people, to take care of the British soldiers abroad, and take care of British interests and Indian interests. This was pure greed, where they deprived the Indian people of salt to the point where tens of millions of them died. There was just a total disregard for the Indian culture and their people. And as you pointed out, which is important to point out, as late as World War II, in the 1900s, Parliament was made aware of this. There was just a total disregard for the Indian people.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. So as I had said before, to your point, there was so much salt that the British could have made sure that every Indian has as much salt as they want. All the British soldiers had as much salt as they want, and they could export as much salt as they wanted elsewhere. But then they wouldn't get their tax money because people would not be paying them tax. So there was this person called Dr. Sir Cecil Beedon. He was the secretary of the Board of Revenue in India, and he wrote to the Parliamentary Select Committee after many of these salt mines were closed. The Malangis, which was 60,000 workers, had nothing to do. There was no shortage of salt, but there were no workers to take it out because the British said, you're not going to work here. So they asked him, what happened to those 60,000 workers? And his quote, I'm quoting, quote, I am afraid that a considerable number of them were swept off the face of the earth. Swept off the face of the earth.
What does that mean? Yeah.
They died.
Yeah.
Because they had no work, they had no money, they had nothing else to do. There for generations, all they knew about how to do was to mine the salt, and they had no work. They couldn't go and start working somewhere else. There was no work for these people. They died, and so they were quote unquote swept off the earth. But to what we were talking about, there was plenty of salt, and after that, what happened was the salt started being manufactured in England in less than ideal conditions, but not salt as good. So by 1850, half the salt consumed in India came from England, half of it. When there was so much available, the Indians had to not only pay the salt tax, they had to actually buy salt from England, which is such a shame.
Yeah.
And they couldn't afford it, so they died of quote unquote famine. The British finally left in 1947. Large scale salt production in the 1700s and 1800s was only feasible at a few sites, which they blocked off. How did they block it off? They blocked it off by a hedge that was built. The hedge that they built. I mean, I've often wondered after reading this book why the British didn't just build a brick wall. I mean, brick was plentiful in India. They made bricks in India from clay and and mud. They could have built 14, 20-foot high a wall, 14 feet wide, like the Great Wall of China, not with stone perhaps or brick. I don't understand why they did this, but they worked. If you read how hard they had to work to make sure that even in the driest climates, the hottest climates, the British made these Indians slave to plant these 5 different species of bushes. They had to find bushes that grew very tightly together so that not even a mouse could get through. And it had large needles, thorns that would injure you if you tried to even put your hand through that bush. It was so tight that you could not even pass a small little bundle of salt, and
Yeah.
so wide and so high that you couldn't toss over the hedge a bundle of salt. But what they did was every so many miles they had an opening, they had a chokey there, and then they had guards in each opening. Behind that, shortly behind that were people, British soldiers on horseback, that would be riding up and down, for each one was given so many miles, and they would ride up and down to make sure that there was no person there, no Indians there waiting to catch salt that was tossed over from over this hedge. And a few miles down the road was another batch of people on horseback going up and down. 2,300 miles of this, with 12,000 men employed just to make sure that no salt got across. So how much did that cost them? The
Yeah.
construction of the hedge, the paying of these, compared to how much money they made from the salt tax, it was a fraction. I
Yeah.
mean, I have the numbers written down somewhere, but the number of rupees that they got from the salt tax was in the many, many, many millions. The amount that they paid to these 12,000 workers was very little compared to that.
Yeah.
So they've well afforded it. But these men were not allowed to bring their wives there. They were without women. They found that if they had women, that two or three things happened. One was the man would want to rush home in the evening to be with his wife and his kids, and he wouldn't be working. So
Mhm.
they felt that that wasn't good enough. They said no women. Second thing they found was that the women would go and befriend the women in the Indian villages. They would
Mhm.
feel sorry for them, and they would beg their husbands to give them a little leeway and give them some salt, etc. So no women. Third thing they found was that the British soldiers would fight amongst themselves to try to befriend the other man's wife or something like that. So they
Yeah.
said, you know what, just leave the women out of it completely. So what would happen is these men, the British soldiers, were frustrated without any women. And so any woman that went through those guard posts was free reign for them. That led to tremendous amount of abuse of
Mhm.
their powers with women. It's just sickening what happened, just sickening. So anyway,
It's all
I think
horrific. It's
all
just
the whole
all
thing.
horrific when you see the disregard here and the stinginess over an virtually unlimited supply of salt. It's just sickening.
A lot of people who had for many generations been farmers, growing healthy farms, turned to smuggling because in order their farms died, they didn't have the strength to till the farms, so they turned to crime, and they stole and they murdered and they killed gentle, peaceful, honest, religious people turned to crime to get salt for their families, and then they just became criminals. And these farms, of course, died because there was nobody there to till them. So the changes that took place were just absolutely horrible. And what I feel so bad about, I was actually dreaming this last night, that the rage that I feel sometimes when I think of this, I have to suppress it and say, look, the Gita says, forgive, forgive. Don't think of revenge. Don't think of, and who am I going to get revenge from? Or us? Who are
Yeah.
we going to get revenge? Those people are dead and gone. The new generation doesn't even know any of this. The only thing I can hope is that by a podcast like this, that I get the word across to people that don't know. And I think, you tell me if I'm wrong, Lou, I think the majority of the world does not know this.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And as a typical Westerner with a Western upbringing, and we have our own relationship with England here in the United States, of course, but we never had any idea of any of this going on. We've been raised and taught about, again, I'm so glad we use the word Holocaust here, because we've been raised and taught about the Holocaust in Germany with the Jews. And we have never had any teachings about this and what happened in India. And we all have our thoughts about what's happening in the 1500s and the 1600s with English colonization, and we've all been raised on that. And again, we have our own relationship with England, of course. But that this carried on into the 1900s, into the 1930s, into the 1940s and beyond is just stunning to me. This has been a real awakening for me because no, I had no idea of the extent of this problem, had no idea of the salt deprivation, had no idea of the greed, had no idea of the just total disregard for the Indian people.
Yeah. And I just hope that people who are listening to this, pass this on, pass it forward, just make more people aware of this. All right, friends, sorry about the lengthy, but anyway, thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you again next time.